There are dramatic gender disparities and power asymmetries in our society. Data and evidence can help to shine a light on what actions are required and where, and can inform decisions to support gender transformation. But as we know, there are many challenges in getting to decisions and actions. And data also falls short in accurately reflecting the needs, aspirations, and voices of various groups, including within women. In this pre-recorded panel, we discuss with practitioners and service providers how we must work with data to reflect women's stories and lived realities, especially now in the context of the pandemic. We are delighted to bring together a prominent and feisty group of individuals who take stock of whose voices are heard on what topics, the implications of non-representative data, and the role of stories. Welcome. I thought the first topic to touch on was the status of women in India. And specifically, using Shrayana's book as a hook here. Shrayana, I'm going to quote from your book because basically, what you say is Indian women as a sisterhood, basically you see Indian women as a sisterhood of desperate and disappointed women who have learned to expect very little from our institutions and are habituated to inequality. One of the statistics that really stood out to me was very depressing, which was that 37% of all women globally who died by suicide are Indian. And another piece that was really kind of interesting was that as far back in 1974, when Veena Mazumdar wrote for the Committee of Status of Women in India, she said there was evidence everywhere of a declining status of women in the country, including sex ratio, declining employment rate, and rising proportions of women among illiterates. So, just kind of given that we are, where we are, on what makes you optimistic about the status of women in India? And are there statistics that are less gloomy than this?
Women do have a tremendous power within Indian society in some ways, okay? And part of it comes out of themselves. The problem is that I think that they do not have the kind of resources that are needed in order to be able to use that sense of self-worth and power to be able to gain the kind of rightful position they should be able to get.
हमारे यहाँ तो जैसे हम लोग झारखंड में बीआरपी पहले तो हम भी घर के अंदर रहते थे और हमें भी पता नहीं था कि कैसा माहौल है। जब हम लोग बीआरपीएसडी पर कार्य किए उस वक्त जब हम महिलाओं के बीच में जेएसएलपीएस के माध्यम से समूह के माध्यम से उठना बैठना किए तो उनकी जो वर्तमान स्थिति है उनको हम लोग जानने का कोशिश किए, जिसमें महिला को खासकर घर पे पुरुष प्रधान है, घर पे तो पुरुष प्रधान के अलावा महिला प्रधान का अधिकार नहीं दिया जाता है। और महिला को जब भी वो अपने आजादी के लिए या कुछ अपना जो कार्य करने के लिए वो अगर इच्छुक है तो वो खुद से अपने निर्णय नहीं ले पाती थी। और वो उनके जो पुरुष प्रधान है जब तक उनको आज्ञा नहीं देते थे तो वो कुछ कार्य नहीं कर पाती थी। अभी भी वो स्थिति ऐसी है जैसे अभी हम लोग जब बीआरपी में जुड़े हैं तब से कम 30% हम लोग ऐसा सुधार कर पाए हैं, लेकिन अभी भी वही स्थिति है जो पहले महिला थी, घर का काम करना और घर में जो भी स्थिति है और वो जो खाने पीने से लेकर जेंडर सोच तक वो अभी भी जूझ रही है। ये स्थिति है। और जेंडर स्थिति में जैसे कहिए तो पढ़ाई लिखाई के मामले में भी अभी भी बहुत पिछड़े हैं महिला दीदी। जैसे बच्चे भी बहुत बात विचार करने पर पता चलता है कि अभी भी जो लड़कियां हैं वो ठीक से शिक्षा नहीं कर पाती है। खाने पीने से भी बहुत परहेज है कि वो लड़की है तो थोड़ा कम खाती है और लड़के हैं तो ज्यादा खाते हैं, इस तरह का अभी भी देखने को मिलता है, जिससे एनीमिक की शिकार ज्यादा ही दीदी पाई जाती है।
I think women's expectations of their own role in society, what they would like from society, how I think they want men to behave, what kinds of jobs and aspirations they have really expanded. I think now the question really is, as a society and as a set of institutions, can we come up with concrete responses to those expectations?
So I do think that there have been remarkable stories of remarkable success, and I think education enrollment is one of those. You see it at a greater and lesser extent across states, but the growing parity in educational enrollment, both at the primary, secondary, as well as the higher education levels, is really one of those remarkable indicators of India. And what it will mean going forward is another question, and an important question for policy. I also think fertility is one of those remarkable stories, and fertility decisions are not those of a woman alone. So this isn't purely a sort of taking charge of fertility decision, but all of the inputs that have gone into women being in a position or being part of a decision to limit fertility at the speed at which it's happened over the last few decades is again a remarkable story. I also find the story of women's participation in elections surprising and moving. I find it truly surprising, actually, particularly in some states, to see the extent to which parity has been achieved, and in some cases women having even higher voter turnouts than men, considering that women being underrepresented in voter lists, which means even being sort of registered for the vote process, was an important challenge for the Election Commission going back just a few years. What all of these, again, which sort of seem like input indicators in a way, what these big improvements in input indicators mean for output indicators is a big question, particularly because I feel like a lot of the lack of progress that we're seeing is in that end of things. So of course the largest one is the low levels of workforce participation among women, and I know there is debate about the extent to which official data accurately captures women's presence in paid work, let alone the heavy burden of unpaid care work that we now know, particularly through time use surveys, rests on women. But I know Sonalde, for example, has done work on, even considering whether official Indian surveys are doing a good enough job of capturing all of the paid work that women do. I do feel strongly about the role of social norms and the sort of lack of change, or the slow change that's gone on in those areas.
I think what gives me optimism is hope and expectations, actually the conversation around that. But then that's also the frustrating part as well.
एसएजी जब बना, एसएजी हमारे झारखंड में आया, समूह जुड़ी, उसके बाद महिला ज्यादा सशक्त हो गई। उस वक्त हमें महिलाओं का जो अधिकार है या उनका बचत है, या कैसे उनको अपना बचत करना है, कैसे वो ट्रेनिंग के माध्यम से अपने हक और अधिकार के बारे में उनको जानकारी मिला। तो इस तरह से हम लोग का सबसे बड़ा तो हाथ हम लोग का जेएसएलपीएस के जो समूह गठन किया है, वही जो हम लोग को सशक्त किया है। और सभी दीदियां, अभी बहुत सारी ऐसी दीदियां हैं जो बेरोजगार थी, काम नहीं कर पाती थी, उनको रोजगार भी मिल गया और वो अभी बाहर निकलकर काम भी कर रही है और किन्हीं के सामने अपना बात भी रख पाती है। कुछ ऐसे थी कि डरती थी कि कुछ हम किस जगह कोई नेता के सामने या किसी ऑफिसर के सामने बात रखने के लिए डरती थी, वो चीज अब स्वतंत्र रूप से वो रख पाती है। सबसे बड़ा हम लोग का जो एसएजी है, उनका हाथ और जेएसएलपीएस का हाथ बहुत बड़ा है, योगदान रहा इसमें।
data could be very useful in terms of understanding what are women's expectations, how are they changing, how are they relative to men and others in society. So it'll be useful to hear from you in terms of how you see survey data being used to capture the status of women, but specifically, I'm interested in some of these softer aspects that are often not measured.
I think my frustration honestly comes from this almost idea of just add sex and then that's a women's, you've captured women, right? But status of women is not about women or adding a male female binary variable. It is actually a gendered approach. Why are we not looking at lights data or infrastructure data around water, different kinds of areas, thinking about how do we add a gendered lens in how these are distributed, used? I'm sad to say that I think the NSS has really fallen behind, I think, on what a lot of other countries are doing. And there's a lot more that can be done, right? I think private, surveyors are now interested in these questions, and I think that's great. We also have to acknowledge that there is a hubris of data. There are things that data can tell us that can be quantified, that are useful. But there are other lived realities that perhaps require mixed methods, blended modes of approach. And the one complaint I do have of economists, I think particularly, when I look at this work, is, the way they approach qualitative data is almost like, well, the quantitative data is the center, then the qualitative data orbits around it. But actually, there might be areas, particularly I'm thinking of intra-household relations, mobility, questions around violence, questions around sexuality, autonomy. Data is helpful, but I think it needs to be very rigorously blended with rigorous qualitative work.
Today, I'm so concerned about our data systems, okay, that I have almost reached a point at which I don't care about gender anymore. Okay, just get me basic data on, what's the poverty in India, what's the employment rate. So at some level, what I'd like to see both as just a concerned social scientist and a feminist scholar, just a better construction of our data systems. Leave aside the gender part for the moment, okay?
I think one of the things that happens with a lot of people who work with numbers, and most certainly with data journalists who are repeatedly sort of told that they are in the business of communicating numbers to a public that is not comfortable with numbers. This is the sort of broad advice that is always given to data journalists, that you are up against a wall. People don't take warmly to numbers, and you have to cut through this somehow. Humanize. That is the sort of directive given to journalists. Because of that, there ends up being a sort of, in the hierarchy of information, an understanding that stories in some way, at least as a narrative device, are superior to data. And I think people have the exact opposite end of the stick in other circumstances. In a lot of, perhaps in consultancy or in research writing, there would be the understanding that data is superior and that, stories, anecdotes, qualitative work is inferior. I think that happens as well. And figuring out this hierarchy and what works for what circumstance is very difficult. And, there will be multiple answers to this. So for me, the question is, I enjoy talking to people very much. It's something that happens, very naturally on the field. Anyone who, you don't need to be a researcher or a journalist. You cannot go 2 steps from your door without having an interesting conversation with people. And particularly, I think in India, people truly want to share stories. You get into the most intimate conversations with people within minutes. It's actually, it takes you aback. People know this from being on train rides or also being out on the field reporting. I do feel that I enjoy the messiness that stories bring in. And I think that a lot of journalism flattens India into very narrow categories that are sort of clearly defined by data and clearly reflected by well chosen stories. I find that tiresome to read, and also sort of both intellectually and sort of creatively dishonest. So I essentially would like to read the extras files of all reporters, all of the stories that don't fit the narrative that they wanted to use.
हम जब एक क्वांट का और क्वाल का जब करते हैं कोई भी प्रोजेक्ट में, तो वहां पे हमें वो डिफरेंट मिलता ही है, ठीक है, क्योंकि क्वांट में वो सारे सवाल होते हैं जो कि हम बस हाँ या ना में ही लाते हैं, लेकिन क्वाल में वो थोड़ा सा डिस्क्राइब हो जाता है, ठीक है। लेकिन जब हम जैसे कि एक प्रोजेक्ट के दौरान मैंने देखा था, वो फैमिली प्लानिंग वाला था। जब हमने ये सारे सवाल का जवाब जब लाए थे, पहले हमने क्वांट करके तो उतना सारा नहीं आया था, लेकिन जब क्वाल में हम गए तो वहां पे काफी डिटेल में आया। लेकिन वो भी एक डिपेंड करता है कि आपने बस एक क्वेश्चन किया क्वाल में, और फिर वो क्वेश्चन के बेस पे उनका जो आंसर आता है, फिर आपको उसी के ऊपर ही और क्वेश्चन बनाने होते हैं। तो ये एक मैंने देखा था कि महिलाओं के साथ में, ये तो हर किसी प्रोजेक्ट में हर किसी के साथ होता है, लेकिन जो महिला के साथ में जो होता है ना, उनकी वो सारी बातें निकल के आती है जो कि हमने पहले उनसे जब सवाल जवाब किया था उसमें नहीं आ पा रहा है, ठीक है, एक है। और दूसरा है कि एक फैमिली में महिला के साथ में डाटा कलेक्ट करना, मतलब आपको थोड़ा वहां पे टाइम देना पड़ेगा, ठीक है। ऐसा नहीं कि हमने बस सवाल कर दिया और फिर जवाब लेके आ जाए।
एक सवाल था मैम, जैसे हम लोग डाटा कलेक्ट तो करते हैं, तो लेकिन वो डाटा हम लोग को सही नहीं मिल पाता है कभी भी, तो उसके लिए हम लोग ऐसे छूट जाते हैं कुछ ऐसे महिलाओं को जिनको बहुत ज्यादा तकलीफ होता है, जो अपने जो घरेलू मैटर है उनको बताना नहीं चाहती है। तो उस लेवल में क्या हम लोग को डाटा या कोई ऐसे हार्ड कॉपी में लेना जरूरी है, या उनके साथ कुछ ऐसा कुछ और एक कुछ नया करे ताकि वो हमें खुल के बताएं, ऐसा कोई और कुछ उपाय हो कि वो हमें सब चीज अपना जो जानकारी है वो दे पाए। जैसे मैम ही बोली कि हाँ या ना में जवाब लिखा होता है, तो वो चीज हमारे यहाँ भी वही समस्या है। तो उस वक्त वहां पर कुछ बोलती नहीं है कि हाँ या ना में तो जवाब दे देती है, लेकिन उसको हम लोग को किस तरह निकालना है ये हम लोग को थोड़ा सा प्रॉब्लम होता है। तो इसके लिए कुछ ऐसा उपाय है जो हम लोग दीदी को और बेहतर तरीके से उनका ये निकाल पाए।
बेसिकली ललिता जी, मुझे यहाँ पे जब मैंने देखा है तो क्या होता है ना कि अगर आप महिलाओं के साथ में ज्यादा जुड़ी हुई थे, जैसे कि हमने फील्ड पर देखा है हमारी आशा दीदी या फिर आंगनवाड़ी दीदी, उनके साथ में वो काफी इजीली सारी चीज शेयर करते हैं, राइट। बट हम लोग क्या करते हैं, हम कभी जब हमारी जरूरत होता है हमारे प्रोजेक्ट के हिसाब से हम, या फिर हमारी डाटा के हिसाब से हम उनके पास जाते हैं और वो एक बार में वो लेकर आते हैं। और इससे ये तो है कि हमारा ये काम है, हम ये डाटा को लाना है। लेकिन जब एक आप महिला, कुछ महिलाएं ऐसे होते हैं जो कि वो खुल के बात कर लेते हैं, और बहुत महिला ऐसे, कुछ महिला ऐसे भी होते हैं जो बात नहीं कर पाते हैं क्योंकि उनका डर रहता है कि ये डाटा पता नहीं कहाँ जाएगा, किसके साथ में शेयर होगा, कहीं इस वजह से मेरे फैमिली में कोई प्रॉब्लम नहीं होगा। तो इसके लिए एक तो है कि हमारा जो कम्युनिकेशन जो है उनके साथ में गैप रहता है, ठीक है। तो इस वजह से वो महिलाएं, अब अगर हमको कोई मैं अगर आपको जानती ही नहीं हूँ तो फिर मैं आपको कैसे मैं अपनी चीज में बताऊं, या फिर अगर मैं आपसे कुछ पूछूंगी तो फिर आप मुझे किस हिसाब से बताओगे, क्योंकि मैंने आपको पूरा एक बैकग्राउंड दिया, आईडी इंसाइट से है, हम लोग ये काम कर रहे हैं, हम इसीलिए आपसे बात करना चाहते हैं, फिर आपको या फिर मुझे थोड़ा सा कंफर्टेबल फील हुआ, राइट। तो ऐसे ही क्या होता है कि महिलाओं को ये थोड़ा सा डर रहता है कि हम उनके साथ में जो डाटा जो लाते हैं ये किस तरह से, लेकिन ये तभी हो पाएगा जब हम उनके साथ में बार बार इंटरेक्शन में रहेंगे, उनके साथ में टच में रहेंगे। तो यही एक रास्ता मुझे अभी के लिए जो दिखाई दे रहा है, क्योंकि अगर आशा और आंगनवाड़ी दीदी को पूछेंगे ना तो उनके साथ में उनका इतना इंटरेक्शन रहता है कि उनके घर के बारे में, उनके मान लीजिए कि कहीं पे उनके किसी बच्चे का शादी कब है, ठीक है, और उन्होंने क्या बनाया था क्या नहीं, मतलब हर एक चीज उनके साथ में शेयर होते हैं, क्योंकि वो उसी के साथ में उनके क्षेत्र में एकदम डीप तक जाके उनके साथ में वो इंटरेक्शन में रहते हैं। तो यही फर्क दिख रहा है मुझे।
जी मैम, थैंक यू मैम।
So many of the women say they want to work, And even if their parents let them work and go outside, they can't migrate out because the corridor and the pipeline, there's so much work even by Professor Rohini Pandey on this, the pipeline from the household to a location where your job would be involving housing markets, transport markets, credit markets, all of that is stacked against often single women in particular. And I think if we actually started to look at access to those, right, and who's accessing what are the costs of access, and I think here actually we will probably have to bring in private players as well, because some of them hold some of this data, which is obviously right now not regulated, its use and how it can move, right? One of the questions I often ask is, why don't we give incentives, for example, to landlords who say have women who live in their home? This has actually been done in other countries to try and encourage places to actually offer safe and good housing and accommodation to women. But I really think we need a deeper engagement with mobile phone data, housing data, rental data. These are the areas where I really think we need to be looking at very strong fixes, because without that, say, the employment problem, you won't be able to crack, because it's not a household problem only. It's a problem of other infrastructure markets. It's not just the job market and the household.
So shifting a little bit back to the workforce discussion, I really like the way your book lays out basically how, the majority of jobs in India are poor quality, right? Whether it's for males or females. And then, for example, how coveted a government job is. And you quoted from a survey of teenage girls who really, the top choice for them was to become teachers, doctors, or nurses. But there's just such little space for, these women to do that. So given this, basically the lack of good quality jobs, one is, how do you get women to then, and also the number one job for women is actually domestic work. So, it's not surprising almost that women are then opting out of the workforce. And that, I don't really hear much about that discussion either, is that maybe they're opting out because of the quality of the jobs. And then there's, as you alluded to, the social norms of maybe as you're becoming wealthier, you just opt out because you have more of a choice. And there's the honor trade-off also, is that, you can afford to do that. So how does all of this play into like a forward-looking strategy? What do you do to facilitate more women working, but also acknowledge that maybe they don't want to be part of this labor force, and maybe a reduction in labor force participation is showing some sort of a choice taking place?
So this question of the quality and quantity of jobs as being a key factor in what the labor force participation numbers show is something that people like Ashwini Deshpande and Sonalde have been looking at and talking about much more recently. And clearly both for men and women, as you say, the quality of jobs is a problem. Wages are a problem. Benefits on the job are an enormous problem, and all of that, of course, translates into this huge squeeze for government jobs, which, among other things, not just offers sort of more dependable wages and some sort of stability, but also to some extent, mediates these social inequalities that sharply affect jobs in the private sector, for example. So even the gender wage gap is much narrower in government work than it is in the private sector, and it is a sharp wage gap in the private sector. Of course, this operates significantly in terms of caste groups as well, which is at the same job level, forward castes are much more likely to be paid much more than people from than OBCs and SCs and STs, which is again something I think we don't talk about enough, because this is at the same job level that we're talking about, and these differences are mediated to some extent in the government sector. So sometimes this focus on this almost sort of incredulity about why people are so focused on government jobs. I mean, it not just has a very clear and obvious sort of economic dimension, but the aspect of dignity or some level of dignity that these jobs can provide is also something we perhaps need to talk about more. I, still strongly feel from all of the data that that's out there, all of the research that's done, is that I don't think that we are seeing evidence of women opting out or of these being sort of privileged decisions of of choice. So there are trade-offs that are clearly going on over here, but I don't think that those are trade-offs that come from a position of great choice. And one of the biggest trade-offs, clearly, that's apparent in conversations and as well, and from the data as well, which is the impact of the unequal share of responsibility in both domestic duties as well as childcare on the ability of women to be to participate in the paid workforce. We see this from the responses that women give to the NSSO, for example, which is that what are you doing if you are not in the paid workforce? I'm fully attending to domestic work. And then, of course, while the NSSO is not so much in the position to ask, if not this, then why not? Though I do feel that this is a direction that more research needs to go into. Perhaps the question that should follow from this is, if you had reliable, say, state subsidized childcare, what would it mean? Or if there was a situation in which we could imagine a more equal sharing of domestic responsibilities, what would that mean? Because, this isn't just about being in the workforce and not. We see from the time use survey, for example, that, and this really is a number that stays with me all the time, which is that an unemployed man spends less time on unpaid household work than a fully employed woman, than a woman in the paid workforce. So what it would mean if we were able to in some ways reimagine a world, or if the woman even responding to the survey was able to reimagine this, what would it mean for her choices is definitely something to consider.
I think that there are a few things that the data tell us which we need to sort of pay attention to. The first thing that the data tell us is basically that uneducated women work and women with college education are more likely to work. Okay, it's the women in the middle who have the lowest labor force participation rate. Okay, and part of it is because, if you're not educated, you're willing to engage in casual labor, work in agriculture, and so on. With some education comes aspiration. With that, there comes a desire to find something that is a little bit above the kind of wages that you can make as an agricultural wage laborer. It happens for men, it happens for women. Okay, but men can get a job as a truck driver, as a mobile phone repairer, etc. And those are not the occupations usually open to women. So my first pitch would be the skill development programs. Please stop all the beautician programs, okay, and make an effort to involve women into some of this mechanical and higher skill kind of programs.
But, related to these jobs, there's the social norms piece, right? In the sense that there are these strong kind of, I think you might have seen Alice Evans' work where she's talking about, the honor trade-off with work participation, where, as you rise up the ladder, women are opting out of the labor force just because they think that, working is less valued by their families and by their communities. And we just recently have done a study on sun preference in Rajasthan. And what was interesting, and the team is here, some of them can also join, is that people were, of course, basically as fertility is falling, people are trying to reduce family size. And, there is this strong preference to have at least one son. But what was interesting is that women and men, especially in this case women, are willing to still talk to us saying that they do have a son preference, right? Like we are able to capture that. There is overwhelming evidence that there is son preference. And when we went back to the government, they were not surprised. But I think, in terms of that whole process, as you're saying, there still isn't that embarrassment almost, and they're all the various reasons, as you're saying, because they expect that the girl would be able to, she might be able to study, but she won't be able to work, and they're all the traditional reasons in terms of last rights and all those things. So there's this very strong social norms piece that continues to exist, and curious to hear what you both have to say in terms of how do we address that, because there's something very real in terms of, we've been thinking about it, but curious to hear, like, where is the evidence today, and how do you feel, what are what are the levers that we could use to get women to participate? And you can kind of nuancing that a little bit. There are lots of women who opted out, right? Who kind of consciously opted out. So how do you kind of respect that also?
I think there are a couple of things we do know. I think education is a very important lever. It's not a magic bullet, but it's an important lever. And in fact, it's not just a lever for women being in the workforce. It is a lever for a more progressive workforce in terms of social attitudes, because we do know that women with education, in terms of the nutrition that the kids are having, there are all these other, what we would call more instrumental issues, but also there's a question of attitudes as well, right? So that's one. I think the second lever, I actually will go back to, it's the private sector and the government as an employer. I mean, employers per se to me, and incentives, and it could be tax incentives, which countries like in East Asia have tried. But I think the third, which I think we often talk about, which is care, but I think of it as part of the infrastructure story, so I'm not going to go into it too much. But I think the third, which I actually feel is not the role of statistical systems to tackle, this bit about norms within intimate spheres. I think statistical systems can provide information to improve access to education, to make transport safer, to check law and order better, all of those things, right? Like the environment in which these intimate decisions are being made.
In some sense, I think that what we need to do is recognize that social movements have a role to play. And social movements come both from within women's movement as well as participation in the political process, where you actually hold your political leaders accountable for creating a gender-friendly climate. Okay, so the political parties which are gender unfriendly and repressive should be held accountable.
I do have one follow-up. If the politicians are not engaging on this, and then how do you? And there is lack of a movement on that, and there's kind of a there is no Gandhi talking about this. Then what do we do? So
how about a gender report card on their political utterances?
Yes,
actually,
exactly. Yeah? Oh, absolutely.
Right. So basically, basically going back to Shrayana's point is, not kind of focusing on the policy, but on the social change part. And, I really liked that aspect of Shrayana's, piece, which is, not kind of collecting data or information just for policymakers, but actually to build community, right? And that was very powerful and exciting, I think, for all of us.
Yeah, Divya, can I just come in?
Yeah,
I think we know how many women vote, but one thing that I do think is really important is measuring women's voices in different spheres. Yesterday, there was a study that just came out, which I know went viral, which is about the share of women in the IIS and how many are finance secretaries. Yes. And the numbers are just, none of them surprise us, but I think it's important that every year, just like Asar, I mean, I keep turning to Asar because I do think it was a very powerful example. I think what was really powerful about it was the consistency of it, which is they would say, well, every certain time period, we would collect this data. So in a way, it starts to build a community of knowledge. And then from there, perhaps practice emerges. So I do think that that's important. But I actually want to say we can be our own Gandhis. Why do we have to look to, in our own constituencies, in our own lives? The book shows each one of us is making political choices. I think we can do the same for each one of us.